in a way, if I could be a little anecdotal, I think about, if I can do that, I think about what led me to study or really cultivated my interest in cultural landscapes. And I think a lot of it had to do as a boy, driving around my native South Jersey with my father, my parents, my grandparents. I was always intrigued by the makeup, the texture of different places, the mix of the natural environment and the built environment, and also at times what I thought and perceived, and correctly so, were the differences. And they could be differences that happened rather quickly, whether you were going from, say, the urban area of Philadelphia, near where I grew up, into the New Jersey Pine Barrens. It seemed like, or once you got through the Pine Barrens, you got to the Jersey coastline. And so I would see these different sorts of how would I say this, building arrangements and natural settings, and wonder, wow, what is it that makes this place distinctive? It kind of, for some reason, I responded to that. And of course, as a boy, I'd ask people why, and they, of course, not being cultural landscape scholars, or they would say, well, how do we know? And so but that was always there. I was always moved by the mixture of the natural landscape and the humanly rendered landscape, and the impact that humans had in shaping that landscape. So when I come back to that issue of, cultural landscapes are really an expression of the cultural temperament and the cultural values of a given society at any given time throughout human history. That's probably the most, concise way to describe what a cultural landscape is. And of course, that variation is going to, be in evidence all around the globe. So here we are in the Chesapeake, and I have to confess, I also always had a particular response to areas where land and water intermingled. So I grew up not far from the Delaware River. Again, my life was shaped by the Delaware River, the Delaware Bay, and the Atlantic coastline. So I was always fascinated by a cultural landscape that ultimately was the outgrowth of humans trying to forge some kind of relationship between land and water, whether it was a large industrial infrastructure to facilitate shipping, whether it was people commercially fishing in an area and needed to create that mix, that cultural landscape, which in the case of maritime environments is water. We tend to think of the aqueous environment and the terrestrial environment as two separate things, but they're really all one unified phenomena, and both physically and biologically. And so I was always moved by that, and recreational use as well. People who were using. So to me, that's what's been a driving impetus of my career. I always say I'm happiest. I always make the joke, give me boats and buildings and I'm happy, because and that infrastructure that ultimately fosters a relationship between land and water, which has been so critical to human societies. It's interesting you say that, because historians who study the Chesapeake Bay, and we look at the earliest sort of European Native American contact that existed here, going back to Jamestown and the earliest settlements, and the ultimate development of a plantation society, the Tobacco Coast, as they called it, and the way the topography is organized here, both by natural forces and humanly rendered forces, it provides a very nice, for folks culturally and economically, to have this mix of agriculture, use of marine resources, and also the ability to create an infrastructure where you can move those commodities, whether it's tobacco you're raising or grain crops you're raising, or using marine resources as a commodity. Whether you're talking about any of those, the landscape here really is accommodating in that regard, because you have salt marshes here, but there's lots of areas of the Chesapeake where you have enough high ground where you can build an infrastructure to facilitate the movement of those commodities. So people often ask, why didn't the Chesapeake early on have a metropolitan area compatible with Boston, New York, Philadelphia, or Charleston. Well, the reality, particularly during the 17th and 18th centuries, was that each plantation setting ultimately served as its own little port facility. Ships would come up the Chesapeake Bay and its various tributaries, and each plantation could essentially work with those shipping interests to get their product out into the larger revenue streams of the colonial and then the early federal period of our country. Of course, with Western expansion, you're going to need a port that's going to more efficiently link the Chesapeake region to the hinterland. And ultimately, we start to get a place like Baltimore, which is why Baltimore is such an important port that I often think gets missed in the mix when we look at port cities. It's an incredibly important port because it is a gateway to the interior, just like the Erie Canal was, a gateway to the Great Lakes. From the New York metropolitan area, Baltimore gets you from this part of the world into the Ohio Valley, into the areas where new settlements are ultimately emerging, and American agriculture ultimately will be transformed because those areas are so productive. So the Chesapeake Bay is interesting in that regard, that it's been a landscape, because it didn't industrialize many parts of it, that the landscape still retains a lot of the texture. I won't say it's exactly like the colonial period, but it's certainly, compared to a lot of areas of the eastern seaboard, has more of a flavor, of a texture that would evoke what this area was like during the colonial period. So, because cultural landscapes, we can view them in very instrumental ways as tools to act on whether we want to recreate or whether we want to use it to move a commodity through shipping or whether we want to harvest resources. But cultural landscapes, in doing that, are also benchmarks and reference points for how we live our lives. And they're guideposts, right? So you think about it, here we are in Chestertown, why do people, react to this place the way they do? Why does it resonate with them? And for a lot of people, and this is really a very broad view of cultural landscape, and something I'm very keen on, is that cultural landscapes, if they're providing the means for us to stay out of the cold or stay out of the heat or conduct certain types of economic enterprises, if they're doing that, they're also fostering a particular interface between us and the environment. So we actually, through the places we build and live in and work in, we learn about the environment. So there's a real important environmental sort of literacy that attends to how and what we build. And that's important in and of itself, when you think about it, right? When you think about where you've lived and how that place has been instrumental in how you think about the broader place you live environmentally. On another front, and this is a bit more cultural in nature, and something I'm very keen on, is that if it's doing those things, the built environment, architecture, infrastructure, it's also providing it's a tool of memory. Buildings and landscapes, because they are places where we live and that we animate, ultimately archive our memories. And I think that's really important to think about how they do that. And so when some people, in the case of your example of the African American graveyard, you think about the erasure that happens right there, and that gets lost. And we can trace that, of course, to issues related to racism and American economic, greed and things of thoughtlessness that goes into those things. But there's also a culture. This is what's kind of interesting about America. The term's often used, creative destruction, right? They'll talk about the creative destruction of Manhattan, a place that's constantly being built and rebuilt. That's so much a part of the American ethos. But some societies are really careful about what they tear down because they try to accommodate changes to the landscape so that they don't erase memory, that they don't erase deeply held sentiment about what went on there, whether it was a family history, whether it was an ethnic group or a racial group's history, whatever it might be. People are thoughtful about that before they actually, engage in the destruction of that environment. So this is where preservation of cultural landscapes becomes incredibly important in my mind. Not everybody feels that way. Other people are of the mind that you're just being nostalgic and